Hello, my name is Walter Mundell Harms, and today I'd like to talk to you about politics. Everyone in America seems to have a similar opinion of politics these days. We all agree it's an important thing to discuss, and yet on some level, we all hate talking about it. Fuck, who can blame us? Politics have become a very divisive and exhausting thing to discuss, especially over this past election cycle. There's a lot to unpack. So, before we do, allow me to take a moment to explain exactly what it is you're watching and why I thought it would be important to make this thing. Who the fuck? Let's go back in time so I can tell you a little bit about myself. I was born and raised in Morgantown, West Virginia. I have a mother, a father, a sister, and a brother. Both my parents are left-leaning in their politics, so I grew up calling myself a Democrat. Cut to fall 2015, when I left West Virginia for the first time to study filmmaking in Amherst, Massachusetts at Hampshire College. Now, while I was at Hampshire, I was further immersed in the politics of the left, but also exposed for the first time to what you might call an anti-establishment mentality. So I started questioning all the things I'd thought and felt up to that point, not just about politics, but about, well, pretty much everything. I didn't really know what to make of it all. And then, on November 8th, 2016, some guy named Donald Trump won the presidency. At the time, this confused and upset me. I couldn't fathom how a man like Donald had managed to win the support of the majority of America. And then, a few days later, a flag caught on fire. Mainly because somebody pulled it down and set it on fire. The location where the flag happened to be burned was Hampshire College, and the flag in question happened to be the American flag. Well, in the days following that incident, the administration made a decision to not fly the flag at all. And it's here where things took a bit of a turn. Veterans and other supporters started coming from all over the country to protest what had happened. Countless news stories ran. Calls were coming in every day threatening violence against the school. Eventually, it all died down, and things returned to a somewhat normal state. But the event left an impact on me. You see, the flag issue, like most other political issues, have been presented to me as a binary. You're either for it or you're not. Talk about it if you want, but pick a side. And it was at this point I realized something important. Right and wrong are subjective. Personally, I didn't condone the burning of the flag. I've always been proud to be an American, and I love the flag and what it represents to me. But on the other hand, I saw why burning the flag was necessary. Think about who we just elected. Someone who's born with a silver spoon in his mouth, someone who frequently made terrible, disparaging comments towards all sorts of different people, someone who had multiple sexual assault allegations against him. The list goes on. No matter what your opinion of Donald is, you can't deny that his actions and rhetoric are, at best, marginalizing and divisive, and at worst, hate-filled and bigoted. So why shouldn't people feel like their country has turned its back on them? This election was a giant fuck you, and you were either the one shouting it or the one who was being shouted at. And the latter of those two certainly heard, and they responded to the shouting. And who am I to say they aren't justified as someone who has never experienced prejudice and oppression firsthand? So, I arrived at the place I'm currently at with all of this. No one can really be right. No one can really be wrong. Everything is up for debate. There is no place for binaries in politics. There are no parties, only people. So, I decided to make a movie. My original idea was to gather together a group of people from vastly different backgrounds with vastly different political ideologies, sit them down, interview them, and put it all together in a short film so that everybody was represented equally and fairly. I failed miserably, for a lot of reasons. During production, I hit numerous roadblocks, from canceled interviews to scheduling conflicts to freak snowstorms. And beyond that, I'm a procrastinator by nature. I'm bad at setting deadlines and even worse at meeting them. My own work ethic was what eventually fucked me. But above all, the project failed because I rushed into it without a clear sense of what I was doing. I didn't consider the mistakes at the very core of my idea. To show so-called multiple points of view, I would have to call attention to the very things that separated and distinguished the people I interviewed. The way I saw it, there wasn't a way to make the project work without tokenizing people. And even if somehow I managed to circumvent that, I'd have no way of controlling how folks would interpret my movie. It doesn't do much good to have fair and balanced opinion if people are just going to cherry pick what they want to hear and accept that as the film's meaning. So I took a step back and reevaluated what I was trying to do, and realized that what I was attempting to make wasn't actually a representation of people's opinions, but a critique of how those opinions are communicated and received. I decided the best thing to do would just be to turn on a camera and talk. What follows is a personal meditation on how to talk and think about politics. Now, the key word there is personal. This is absolutely a platform for me to express my opinions, make no mistake. However, I will do my best to not discuss my political affiliations. This isn't about the ideas themselves, but rather how they are communicated and received. Also, keep in mind, I'm not trying to convince you of anything. This is my 2 cents. Take it as you will. Allow me first to introduce what I call the order of operations for political positions, or OOP. This is a series of steps I have devised for maintaining and discussing political opinions. They are consider, defend, and convince. The first step is simple. If I cannot justify an opinion to myself, how can I say that I truly believe in it? Thus, when forming an opinion, I must first give detailed consideration to why it could be correct or incorrect. In doing this, I know that whatever position I end up adopting will be the most logical, at least to me, because I have given thought to why it could be right or wrong. Now that may seem like common sense, but here's where things get a bit complex. Step 1 is unique from steps 2 and 3 because it involves introspection, whereas the other 2 relate to discussing thoughts and ideas with other people. It's at this point when I hit what I call the issue of the cognitive disconnect. You've probably heard the phrase, "nobody thinks the same way as you," before, and this sentiment is the sticking point of the issue of the cognitive disconnect. Simply put, communicating ideas is extremely difficult because nobody thinks the same way as me. Allow me to unpack that further by identifying 2 facets for describing mental processes. 1, what I am thinking, and 2, why I am thinking. The what is much easier to explain to another person. I can say, for example, that I believe in God, and thus the other person understands what I am thinking. But when asked why I believe in God, the question becomes a little more difficult to answer. I can certainly put up reasons for my belief in God, such as feeling a divine presence in my daily life. But what constitutes a divine presence? And why do I take that as proof of God's existence? The more I try to rationalize what I believe, the harder it gets to actually articulate why I believe it. So where does the why come from? Well, I know that I am a human, and I know that humans learn through experience. So from that, I can conclude that my belief in God is, in some way, a culmination of various experiences I've had throughout my life. Because I have no way of remembering all those experiences, I cannot truly understand why I believe in God. To do so, I'd have to have detailed access to every memory I've ever had. So now I understand the first part of the cognitive disconnect, the limitations of how I can communicate. But what about how that communication is received? Well, let's take the template of life experiences and apply that to another person. Since they have obviously led an entirely different life than mine, it stands to reason that they'll not only have different opinions, but in fact, an entirely different comprehension of the world we both inhabit. Following that, I can infer that even if we do share some of the same opinions, their reasons for maintaining those beliefs will be entirely different than mine. Let's return to the God example. If I were having this conversation with a fellow believer, they would certainly understand the what of my belief, but they could not comprehend the why. Alternatively, if I were talking to an atheist, they would not even be able to truly comprehend the what of my belief, because their life experiences have led them to rule out any possibility of the existence of a God. The only way I could get either person to understand my position completely would be to explain my mental process, which, given the limitations of spoken language, is impossible. So, the issue of the cognitive disconnect addresses both the limitations of explaining opinions and the limitations of understanding them. Now, that makes politics a particularly difficult thing to discuss, because if I want to achieve any kind of consensus, I need to have a certain level of empathy for my political opposite. Now, If you take the issue of the cognitive disconnect as truth, true empathy isn't actually something I'm capable of achieving. That means I have to put forth extra effort when discussing politics to try and understand the other person as best as I am able.
This brings me back to the order of operations for political positions. Since I understand step 1, I can now progress to steps 2 and 3. In practice, these two are very similar. Convincing a person of something can happen as a result of trying to defend a position, and vice versa. So why are these two separate, and why is defend listed before convince? Well, defending my own position is a far more realistic goal than convincing someone my position is correct. When defending an opinion, I need only explain why my reasons make sense to me, as opposed to why they should make sense to them. However, in doing this, I must keep in mind that anytime I am presented with new information, even in the middle of an argument, I must revert back to step 1 before I can progress to defending myself. If I don't, I abandon the goal of trying to empathize with the other person.
There is another reason convince is listed last. When I'm discussing a political issue with someone, I often have a hard time understanding why they don't see things the same way as I do, despite being aware of the cognitive disconnect between us. Now, this is because, as I've explained before, I have a perception that is unique from anyone else in the world. But, because I have nothing to compare my own perception to, I have a subconscious tendency to project it onto other people. It is necessary then for me to constantly remind myself that my reasons for believing in shit won't necessarily make sense to anybody else.
I'd like to shift gears now and talk about another major problem that affects the way I discuss politics, the issue of binaries. For those of you who are not aware, a binary is an instance where something has two distinct parts. Here in America, binaries are a huge part of our political discourse, evident in the fact that we have two major political parties. Now, granted, in recent years we have seen a surge in so-called third-party candidates, and some of these people have attracted a lot of support. But the presence of binaries persists. When we discuss political issues, we often characterize them as having two distinct sides. Take, for example, the issue of reproductive rights. We often see this issue as having only two positions, pro-life or pro-choice. But if that's true, what would I be, for example, if I supported someone's right to choose to have an abortion but opposed the concept of abortions in general? Would I be pro-life? Pro-choice? Both? Neither? Now, it is worth noting that the presence of binaries in politics makes a lot of sense. As humans, we have a unique ability to recognize patterns, and by putting things into categories, we are able to better understand them. The mistake we often make, however, is recognizing patterns, categories, and, yes, binaries, in places where they aren't actually present. And although I know this is merely my mind trying to make sense of the world around me, not recognizing this can seriously hurt my perception. If I adopt the notion that there are only two sides to our political discourse, liberal and conservative, I'll put everything I know about politics into one of these two categories. This is unwise baggage to carry. Take the issue of illegal immigration. It is a common understanding that so-called conservatives tend to take up a strict position on this issue, whereas so-called liberals tend to be more relaxed in their stance. That doesn't mean that all conservatives are in favor of building a border wall, nor does it mean that all liberals think we should open up our borders to anyone. But if I allow myself to submit to the binary, I will inevitably assume these things about people before they ever get the chance to open their mouth. And herein lies the issue with binaries. If I simplify how I look at things, my mind will become full of preconceived and often incorrect notions about other people.
Fuck, that was a lot. I hope that all made sense. It's over now, regardless. At this point, I bet you're wondering, where does this leave me? What did any of that mean? What do I do with this information? Do I define the corporate ethos, or does the corporate ethos define me? Unfortunately, I cannot answer any of these questions. What I have presented to you has as much or as little meaning as you see fit to assign, and it's not my place to tell you how to interpret it. What I can share with you is what all of this means to me. If I can say with honesty that I am doing everything I can to question my thoughts, explain my opinions, understand other people, and know my limitations, then I can be satisfied with my positions. Okay, it's over. Good night.